Hi there, and welcome to the Carpenter's Desk. Today we'll be discussing on the topic, the historicity of religious claims and why Christianity stands apart. And to discuss this very interesting topic, we have none other than the prominent historian and New Testament scholar, Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Habermas is currently a distinguished research professor of apologetics and philosophy at Liberty University, Virginia. And over the years, he has done extensive research on the historical Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And some of his books include The Case for Resurrection of Jesus and The Historical Jesus. In fact, he is considered as the greatest authority on the topic of resurrection of Jesus. Welcome, Dr. Habermas.
I am glad to be with you folks. I've been interested in things going on there for a long time, and it's great to be talking to you in person.
Amazing. And Dr. Habermas, as I begin my discussion, I would like to quote an article that I recently read that you co-authored with Benjamin C.F. Shaw. It said that, every religion claims to be historical, but only Christianity is. Now, before we dig into the claims of Christianity, can you please explain a little bit about historicity and why is it important?
Sure. Yeah, historicity is very important because people can hold any philosophical positions they want. They can say, I believe in this, or this is the nature of the world, or my philosophy says X, Y, Z. But if you want to know if it's based on historical truth, now I realize a lot of religions and Hinduism and Buddhism are two of them. I know they often say in their writings, whether something happened is not so important as whether it's a true comet, whether it's a true philosophy, whether we can, a person who never lived before, there could be a fateful saying and it's irrelevant if they said it. It depends on if it's true. However, if it's a religion or a history that teaches that things actually occurred, and then if it goes further and teaches that these things are only true if they occurred, then you've got to know what history's like. And Christianity, it's not popular today to say Christianity is this or that, Christianity is special. Everybody thinks their religion's special, and they have a right to think that. But if you're going to compare history, I would compare the history of Christianity easily. It compares very well to any other religion. I'll give you examples if you want, but we can take the holy books of any of the major religions. Do you want me to go through a few of those, or?
Yeah, definitely. You can, just elaborate on why, Christianity is more historical, or why do you think the claims of Christianity are, specifically
Sure.
historical? What do you think about the other scriptures?
Sure. Well, okay. First of all, to start, this has a lot to do with the date of a document in relationship to when the document was written. How much time has gone on? And if there's a history of tradition where, let's just pick something out. Zoroaster is a Middle Eastern prophet, and he lived hundreds of years BC, although it's hard to pin a date down. But the earliest theological writings for Zoroastrianism do not, for the most part, they're not written down for 800 to 1,000 years later. Now, if you told me Jesus lived in the first century AD or BCE, whatever you say, but the first document we have for Jesus wasn't written until 1030, about 1,000 years later, I would say, how do people in 1030 know what Jesus said in 30 AD? How would they know? Oh, well, it was handed down for centuries. Well, that's good. And some handing down is fine. But in Christianity, there is oral testimony. But when they say it's handed down, they mean for 2 years. They can actually demonstrate that it was handed down for very short periods of time and written down very soon after that. And you might say, well, yeah, but that's a Christian view. Of course you guys are going to say good things about Christianity. I'd say, no. You're missing my point. The folks who will cite this time to you, for example, Jesus dies by crucifixion in 30 AD. There are sources that go back to just 1 or 2 years after crucifixion. You say, again, that's your view. It came later. I say, wait a minute. If it's only my view, and if it's only because I'm a Christian, why do atheist New Testament scholars admit this? They're specialists, but they're atheists. And the next guy is a Jewish New Testament scholar. He's a Jewish New Testament scholar with a PhD in New Testament. One of them I'm thinking of, he has a PhD from a German university, but he's Jewish. He's not a Christian Jew. He's a non-Christian Jew, very friendly. I've heard him speak, and well, he's passed away now, but I heard him speak years ago, and he will tell you this, that we have eyewitness testimony from immediately after the crucifixion. Now, it takes a while to explain this. Now, if you compare that, gave you the example of Zoroaster. The earliest copy we have of the Upanishads of Hinduism, the earliest copy we have is about 1,800 years after its writing. Well, a lot goes on in 1,800 years. And the Bhagavad Gita, I have a source from a Hindu scholar. This guy is a Hindu scholar, not a Christian writing about Hinduism. He's a Hindu scholar. And he said, the majority of Hindu scholars do not believe Krishna lived. But let's just say he did. The century in which he was thought to live, the earliest copy of the Bhagavad Gita we have is 4,200 years later. Now, in a culture where texts are added to, and in a culture where you might only have 1 or 2 copies or 3 copies, what do you do with there's variant readings where they disagree what this person's teachings were? The sources don't line up. So those are some examples. Here's one other example. Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu of Taoism. Those 3 are Far Eastern religions in China and to the little countries just west of China. And in the earliest writings, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius were naturalists. They didn't even believe in God. In the earliest writings, they didn't believe in God. You go, whoa, no, I've got this writing and he talks about God. Yeah, when was that writing? What's the date of the writing? Oh, it's 500 years after after he died. Okay, how do I know that's accurate? Because Buddhist scholars agree that the earliest writings, he might have believed in a power or a source, but he didn't believe in a creator God. So anyway, those are some examples. If your earliest writings are 5, 6, 7, 1,000, 4,200 years after the fellow lived, it's really hard to say we know what they taught. In fact, I've got a book on my shelf. I'm in my library. I've got a book on my shelf over here by a Buddhist scholar, a PhD Buddhist, and the name of the book is Buddhist Scriptures. And he says right at the beginning, this is a Buddhist scholar with a PhD. He started right at the beginning, he said, we don't have sources like Christians do. He said, I want to say this right off the bat. He said, they have the words of Jesus. We do not have the words of Buddha. He said, they have the disciples of Jesus. We do not have the disciples of Buddha. Then he said, they have the disciples of Jesus. We do not have the disciples of Buddha. In fact, he said, I am giving you in this book what I think are the best Buddhist writings, so you can be blessed by them, but they are all about 600 to 800 years after Buddha died. He said, so don't expect the historical argument from us. We don't have it. And then he said this. He said, we don't even know what the Buddha taught. We don't even know his actual teachings or what school of thought he belonged to. Now, that may not bother a lot of people, but if you're going to say something's true, you can say any saying is true you want to. But if you're going to tell me something happened, like Buddha sat under the tree and he was enlightened, Buddhism depends on him being enlightened at a certain point in time and him being a prophet. But if the earliest sources are hundreds of years later, I've got issues with that. I can listen politely. I can study it. I'm interested, but I can't call that evidence. So sorry, I've gone on for a long time, but that's the importance, and that's an example of historicity.
So once you have, as you have mentioned, how the documents, like Christian documents, can be dated very early and very close to Jesus. Some historians, you were mentioning about atheist historians also. Now, some of them, when they study such historical documents that regards with religion, they come with this idea of methodological naturalism. That means they would think that um, these miracles that are mentioned in the Bible are beyond the scope of historical study. But then we have historians like you who study these historical documents and have no problem in studying them and weighing them factually. How do you respond to such anti-supernatural bias that these atheistic historians would have towards the scripture?
Okay, of somebody who actually is a naturalist, right? They actually are. They disbelieve the supernatural, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I would go at it from several different directions. Now, I've got friends of mine here in the university who are specialists on God's existence. They would talk about intelligent design. They would talk about the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, we use that name, Kalam cosmological argument. It's very cosmopolitan. It was first propagated by Muslim philosophers. These are Muslim Thomists. They follow Thomas Aquinas. So some of my friends would use those kind of arguments for God. I'm happy with that, but I don't go that way. I would use historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which is so early and so good. Hey, here's an example. I just saw a book by an atheist German New Testament scholar. He's a New Testament specialist, but he's an atheist. And the name of the book is something like, very close to this. The name of the book is The Earliest Christian Epistle, the earliest epistle in the New Testament. And it was the book of 1 Thessalonians, which everybody dates to 50 AD. 50 AD minus 30 AD is only 20 years. Now a lot of our sources are way earlier than that. But as far as the first epistle of Paul, which atheist New Testament scholars won't even argue with you. They'll just concede it. They'll say, there's 13 books with Paul's name on it. 7 of them are authentic. You say, what about the other 6? Yeah. We'll talk about that some other time. But let's talk about these 7. 1 Thessalonians is one of them, and it's plus 20. And when I'm speaking in a crowd, I'll say, how many of you remember things from 20 years ago, and they're the most important events in your life? It's your marriage. It's the death of a father, the death of a mother, the birth of a child. You were there and you saw that birth of a child. How many of you, if you died and your eternal life depended on you remembering what happened when you saw your child born, how many of you are sure it would be a pretty accurate description? And hands go up all over. 20 years ago. Yep. How many of you from 40 years ago? Because 35 or 40 is the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark. John is probably the latest book in the New Testament, and it's 65 years later. And I'll say, all right, let's talk to the older folks here. How many of you remember things that you would stake your life on it, and it happened 65 years ago? How many of you remember your 50th wedding anniversary? And names go, hands go up all over it. I'll say, well, that's how good the data are. But what if 65 is fine? The first gospel, 35 or 40, Mark, is fine. First epistle of Paul, 20, is fine. But a lot of Paul's sources, Bart Ehrman, an atheist New Testament scholar, an atheist, does not believe in God or an afterlife. He said that we have a bunch of texts backing up the deity of Jesus. Jesus claimed to be deity, his death by crucifixion, and his resurrection from 1 to 2 years after the cross, 1 to 2 years after crucifixion. And my source is an atheist New Testament scholar. The Jewish New Testament scholar I just told you about a little while ago, he would say the same thing. I could give you 40 sources of critics who would say the same thing. They just concede it because the evidence is so good.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, how these sources are very early in the sense, but you
Right.
know, when we talk about India, and you know, there are some few skeptics or you know, few scholars who have pointed out the similarities between Christ and an Indian deity called as Krishna. Now, they say that, you know, it could have happened that, you know, the early Christian writers might have been drawing from the story of Krishna. Now, how do you respond to such arguments is there any truth in such kind of arguments, and how do we go about it? How would you respond to such arguments?
Sure. Well, I think there are many, many problems with that kind of claim. If you're going to tell me Jesus's words sound like Krishna's words, or Krishna's words sound like Jesus' words, say it whichever way you want. Krishna is supposed to have lived before Jesus, but if you say that maybe Jesus got his ideas from Krishna, I would say two things right off the bat. I would say, how close are Krishna's teachings to Krishna? How close? And if you tell me they're 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, I would say, you know, it's much more likely that the Indian sources copied off of the Jewish sources, and they're repeating the stories of Jesus. We know for sure, by the way, some of the stories of Krishna from 300 AD. Now, that's way, way, way after Krishna's birth. But some of the stories of Krishna, they're the same stories that are in the Gospels, only they're attributed to Krishna or to Buddha instead of saying Jesus. It's the same story, but from about the other people. But their sources, the Buddhist sources or Krishna sources, the Bhagavad Gita, are way, way, way later than the gospel sources. And you could say, all right, well, let's think about this. Maybe you Christians just believe the gospels were written earlier, but they're way later. Unfortunately, for that kind of argument, we have those sources. We have the earliest complete set of the New Testament. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the greatest resurrection chapter in the New Testament, 58 verses. And the earliest papyri, where you cut a plant and slit the plant and open the plant up and attach the plant so that you have pages of plant-like material, but you can write on it. It's like early paper, that papyri paper. That's where we get the idea. And we have those sources from just about 150 years after they were written. We have it. So if the other sources are 10,000, 3,000, 1,000 years later, who came first? I have the source. I don't have the actual papyrus that Paul wrote on, but I have a copy of it that's in the British Museum, or it's in this special collection or that special collection. And if you want to talk about which story is earlier, who made this story up first about the birth of Jesus versus the birth of Buddha, if you want, and about the miracles that happened, if the Buddha source is 600 or 800 years after Buddha died, and the source for Jesus is the copy is 150 years later, tell me who's sooner. The gospel, Jesus lived after Buddha, but the Christian source is dated, carbon-14, the Christian source is dated earlier than the Buddha source, even though Jesus was about 600 years after Buddha. So as far as historical arguments, it's really rough to get an argument against these early Christian sources, because they're not just one or two. There are hundreds of them from a very short time after. Why do atheist New Testament scholars who don't believe in God or an afterlife, why do these naturalists you're talking about, why do these naturalists tell you the Christians are right? These sources come from directly after the cross. By the way, some of the sources are archaeological sources. Some of them are things that are written in stone, or they're finds where we have them in their museums. So in terms of data, I'm not trying to be nasty, but in terms of data, there's no comparison. I mean, they're light years away from each other.
Oh, so when we, as you told about, the historicity of Christianity, some Hindu scholars, as you know how different, Hindu thought is from the Western thought. So they might
Right.
say that it's not necessary how historical these characters are. There's a guru called as Sadhguru. He said, you don't care about how historical Rama is or how historical Jesus is. It is what the idea and what they teach us that matters. And
Okay.
as Christians, we often claim that Jesus is the only way to God. And going through couple of your videos, I also stumbled upon where you had doubts and you consider taking up Buddhism. So how do you respond to such kind of arguments?
I've not said this very often, but when people hear that story about me studying Buddhism and thinking Buddhism might be true, that story has nothing to do with Buddhist historical sources. It has to do with Buddhism and modern science. So the arguments had to do with physics. They were arguments in physics. Now, I rejected the argument, but I did entertain it for a long time. But they're not based on historical arguments. Now, here's why history is important again. In the New Testament, Christians are told that a whole lot of things are true, theological things. See, Hindus can believe theological things, and they're not linked to anything. They just believe it. And the different Hindu groups can disagree horribly with each other, just like Christians can disagree. But Hindus can disagree with Hindus, or in your country, Hindus can disagree with Muslims or Buddhists in your country. But when somebody talks about what is the Hindu original teaching, if someone says, oh, you just made that up. You made that up last week. Or your favorite teacher made that up 100 years ago. That's not what Krishna taught. That's not what Buddha taught. That's not what Muhammad taught. The minute you appeal to history and you're a good disciple of Muhammad or Buddha or Krishna or Jesus, the minute you make that claim, you've made an historical claim. And what kills me is when liberal scholarship or Hindu scholarship, I used to make my students read Hindu sources and Buddhist sources and Jewish sources and Muslim sources. And when they would read that, when they hear the Christian sources, they go in to unpack this stuff and they end up admitting the whole argument because the evidence is really, really strong. Well, again, why would an atheist New Testament, and there's many of them, why would an atheist New Testament scholar or a skeptic or a Jewish New Testament scholar, why would they admit that the earliest sources are 1 to 2 years after the cross if they're not Christians? All right. So they would go in and they would study it and they would go, yeah, your sources are really early. But the Buddha says, or Krishna said, and right away, unless you know, they don't tell you that they're quoting things from 1,000 years later. So look, if you want to tell me, well, I'm a pretty easygoing guy and my religion is this and my religion's that, then say that. But don't quote Buddha. Don't quote Krishna. Don't quote somebody who is so long after the fact, like this Buddhist fella, the Buddhist scripture, like he says, I'm a Buddhist. I'm a PhD. I'm a Buddhist. But we don't know what Buddha taught. So if you want to say Buddha sat under the tree and was for 40 days and he's enlightened, I would think that would be important to you. I would think you would want to know that really happened. And he died when he was 80 years old. Okay, well, that's important. And his teachings are ethically pure. Well, first of all, I do not doubt that there are great teachings in the world religions. I wouldn't question Buddha's ethical teachings. I still think about, in my era, I still think about the Buddhist priests who set themselves on fire during the Vietnamese War because they were protesting killing each other. I appreciate that. I'm pro-life. I agree with them. I appreciate that. I can appreciate the ethics, but the minute you say, Buddha taught this, I'm being true to my master, how do you know when you have no sources from your master? I don't mean he didn't. You could say, well, Jesus didn't write anything either. But we have sources from people who were right there with him, who also gave their lives for what they taught. But here's the difference. The Buddhist priests who died during Vietnam, they did it because they deeply believed in an ethical right and wrong. The Christians who did it, they're a little bit different. They believed in the ethical right and wrong, but they said, here's my main view. Jesus died by crucifixion, and he was raised from the dead, and I saw him. Now you tell me, which belief is more likely? That an ethical view you hold is true when your buddies disagree with it, or that you saw something happen, like the birth of your child, your 50th wedding anniversary, the death of your dad, you remember those things. I would say the person who's reporting something, especially if you wrote it down and it was published a few months after your dad died, a few months after your child was born, and it's in a journal somewhere because you're well known, so it's in a journal, I would trust that report written right after than I would trust your belief about babies that are born or fathers that die. So I'm saying even Hindus and Buddhists who say we don't really care about history, we only care about truth, they can say that to a certain extent. Now, I wouldn't dispute the ethics that we share, but I think they too often say they don't believe in history, and then they fall back on history to make historical claims about Buddha, Krishna, and Buddha's enlightenment and what he saw and what he did and what he taught.
Exactly. So, as we were discussing a lot about history and historical authenticity. Just stepping into the theology part, one of the famous figures from India who is also popular in the West is Swami Vivekananda. And
Right.
along with him, there are many Hindu thinkers who called Hinduism as the Sanatan Dharma, meaning the eternal religion. Now, when he was addressing in 1893 at Chicago at the Parliament of World Religion, he called Hinduism as the mother of all religions. And he also considered Christianity as a collection of little bits of Indian thought and very patchy imitation of Hinduism. Now, when we talk about, about the length of years, for example, Christianity is only 2,000 years old. And they claim that Hinduism would be more than 4,000 or even 5,000 years old. So from this argument, what some would suggest is that since Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world, all other religions came out of Hinduism. So how would you see this? And please elaborate on this.
Yeah, I don't want to sound real judgmental, but here's a couple thoughts. If Hinduism is 4,000 to 5,000 years old, and I'll grant that argument, old does not equal true. The oldest guy in the village is not necessarily the smartest guy in the village. And the oldest guy could be a loser. He could be a criminal. Old doesn't prove anything. Secondly, it is not true that all religions of the world came from Hinduism. Just because Hinduism is old, it's old in a very specific geographical area of the world where views didn't get around very quickly. We don't have writings from back then, so we don't know. That's second point. Third point, when the other views teach what they teach, Judaism, Christianity, even Buddhism, and later Islam, their views are not Hindu views at all. Now, if you're talking like, well, we believe in the sanctity of life, I would say a lot of religions do. I mean, the Apostle Paul said that God, the existence of God is knowable from the stars. He said knowable from the universe, but also from the ethical code in us. He said everybody has an ethical code. I have no problem with Buddha being ethical. I have no problem with Krishna being ethical. I have no problem with any. These people are probably called prophets because they had some pretty good teachings. I think that's a solid religious teaching that religions have in common. But it doesn't make it Hindu. I wouldn't even call it Christian. It's not Christian. It's Christians who believe in ethics, but those ethics are shared by the religions. And God, Paul says God's available in the stars, so to speak. A lot of religions believe in God. Now, Buddha didn't at the beginning. Confucius didn't at the beginning. Lao Tzu didn't at the beginning. But a lot of religions do. A lot of religions believe in an afterlife. A lot of religions believe in worship. A lot of religions believe in prayer. But to whom are you praying? And whom are you worshiping? At the minute you go, well, I'm worshiping so-and-so because they taught this. I go, time out. How do you know what they taught when you don't have any sources? Here's this Buddhist guy saying, we don't know what Buddha taught. Here's a Hindu scholar who says, we don't know what Krishna taught. And in fact, like I said, just repeat, he said that most Hindu scholars believe Krishna never lived. Now, again, the person could say, but love your enemy and do no murder. Here's a good example. It's very possible that Buddha taught something like the Golden Rule before Jesus taught it. Very possible. Why do I have a problem with that? I don't have a problem with it. Even the Christian scriptures and Hindu scriptures and Buddhist scriptures, they say that people are born with an ethical sense. Being ethical, I hope you are. I hope everybody is. I respect those Buddhist priests during Vietnam who set themselves on fire. I respect that. But that doesn't make anybody's religion true. That makes their ethics true. Okay, and that's another argument. So Hinduism, as you said, could be dated 4,000 to 5,000 years old. Well, Christianity, Jesus is the main founder, and that's 2,000 years. But Jesus said, my words are based on the words of Moses, the words of David, the words of all the prophets, he said, over and over. Christianity accepts the Old Testament. In fact, the kind of Christianity I subscribe to, what might be generally called evangelicalism, which teaches that you should have a personal relationship with Jesus based on his teaching. So right away, it's a historical argument. But that teaching, you can't be a follower of Jesus and not believe that he thought his teachings went way back to Genesis and the creation of the world. Now, if you're going to use that argument, if Christianity is God sending the prophet, now in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses says, after me, there's going to come a prophet who teaches all the words of God. If you believe that Jesus was expected and that he's the Son of God, and that's just the right time he came, that doesn't mean that's the start of the religion. So Christianity, let's put it this way. If Christianity goes back to Judaism, and if the pre-Judaism, like Abraham, there's a good one, shared by Muslim, Jewish, and Christian believers in Abraham, then that would mean Islam, theoretically, and I'm saying this willingly, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity claim to go back to creation. So it's going to be every bit as old as Hinduism. But again, I don't want to cut my own argument out from under me, but just because it's old does not make it the best. That does not follow. And the teachings, this is something that always bothered me about Hindu philosophers. They say, these guys are teaching the same thing I am. Okay, great. Go back and read Radhakrishnan's teachings and go back and read Jesus's, and you tell me if they're teaching the same thing. If they are, well, then I guess they were teaching the same thing. But if they're teaching different things, don't say they're the same. So I object to the old doesn't make better. Same doesn't equal same unless they really are the same. And here's my third one. If you're going to tell me you know what these guys taught, give me the evidence. Tell me where the history is. I'm not trying to be mean. I've already conceded Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian teachers can all be teaching good ethics, for example. They could be teaching good stuff about God. I don't mean down to the theology, but the fact that he exists and you can see him in nature, like all the philosophers teach, or many of them. Afterlife, we can talk about that, but the fact that there is an afterlife, there's a lot of things in common. But when you start telling me what's the difference between this and that, I want some evidence. I don't want you to just say, yeah, I was talking with my buddies around the campfire last night, and Christians do this too, but I was talking with my buddies around the campfire last night, and he said so-and-so said something, and that must be true, and you go back and check it, it's not there. It's not in the source. If you're going to pin it down and say, okay, but on these divisive things between us, I've got data. I want to know where and what it is. And if you're going to track it to Jesus, I want to see it tracked to Jesus.
Okay. We were discussing on, as you mentioned, about ethics. So, a lot of Hindu scholars have different views on Jesus. So one prominent thinker of the last century was Dayananda Saraswati. So basically on ethics, he said that Jesus was a hot-tempered man and he was a wild savage. This shows that Jesus was neither the Son of God nor had he any miraculous powers. The righteous people do not stand in need of any mediator. Now, Jesus came to spread discord, which is going on everywhere in the world. Therefore, it is evident that the hoax of Christ being the Son of God, the knower of the past and the future, and the forgiver of sin, has been set up falsely by his disciples. In reality, he was just an ordinary man. He was an ignorant man, neither learned nor a yogi. So what Saraswati is saying that, this Hindus or Oriental people have this thought that you become righteous via deeds, via doing your karma. And what he is arguing here is that Jesus was not an ethical person, and you don't need a savior like Jesus to get to heaven, or you don't need a mediator between you and God. So such kind of arguments against the moral side of Christ, does it have any historical basis? And how would you respond to this karma argument that you don't need Jesus to get closer to God?
Well, I would start and I would make a list and I would say, there's this, there's this, there's this, there's this, and all these things show Jesus is unique. But just to make one comment, if he's saying, Jesus was a hot-headed man, lost his temper, you don't have to have Jesus to get to God, I'd say, okay. Let's talk about sources for the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion. Here's a stunner for you. Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion who claimed to be deity. Now, there's a lot of religious founders who say, I'm an avatar or something like that. I'm a prophet, or I'm a specially anointed person. Everybody has who they believe are specially anointed people. But Jesus claimed, I give you evidence all day long for it. I mean evidence that you can check out. But Jesus claimed to be what Christians would call deity. He claimed to be, I don't say, there's no verse where Jesus said, I am God, because that would be confusion. You say, well, who? His father or him? Is he saying he's his father? Okay, let's cut through that. He claims to be the Son of God, and the New Testament calls him Lord, which is interesting, because in the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and a very little bit of Aramaic, but the Old Testament was translated into Greek BC, in the 2 centuries before Jesus, translated into Greek. In the Greek New Testament, Yahweh, the holiest name for God in the Old Testament, is translated as Lord, Kyrios, in Greek. So when you're translating the New Testament, you don't use an Aramaic word because your audience doesn't speak Aramaic. So the Greek translation is Kyrios, and over, it says that Jesus was seated on the right hand of God. He claimed, he said to the Jewish leaders, who is the Messiah? And they said, he's the son of David. And Jesus said, well, okay, good. But if he's only the son of David, how come David called him Lord? And they go, whoa, because that's in caps. That's in capital letters, because in the Hebrew, that's Yahweh. That's Jehovah. All right. So I don't know of a religious founder. Muhammad would never claim that. Moses would never claim that. Krishna. Okay, whatever Krishna claimed, we don't have it because the sources are way later. Buddha never claimed that, didn't even believe in God. They didn't say son of God. They didn't say Lord or Jehovah. They didn't say those things. But here's where I would go on that right away. The guy said, we don't need Jesus. We'll take our guys. I'll say, wait a minute. Was the guy you're talking about raised from the dead? Arguably, from these good historical sources that are only 1 year after the cross? By the way, one major New Testament scholar, a critic, he says the teaching that Jesus was raised from the dead, we can trace it to the same year he was crucified. We can trace the same year. So if the guy said, well, why should I follow Jesus? I would say, was Krishna raised from the dead? And he would say, I guess he would say, what difference does that make? And I say, well, okay, well, let's think about this. A dead man can't do much. Dead bodies don't do much. And if Jesus claimed to be this, let's take two radical claims. Jesus claimed to be deity. He claimed to be the Son of God. And he claimed that what you do with him determines where you spend eternity. You go, well, that sounds like you conservatives. No, that's a guy named Rudolf Bultmann, a very, very skeptical German New Testament scholar, said, he's paraphrasing, but Jesus didn't just say, I have the words of life. Every prophet says, I have the words of life. Jesus said, I have the words of life. But he also said, I am. Philosophers call that ontology. He claimed to be the words of life. In other words, what you do with him determines where you spend eternity. Okay, let's think about those two things. I am deity, and what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. He dies. Dead people don't do much. He claimed his father was going to raise him from the dead. You go, yeah, what do you know? Well, here's the problem. He was raised from the dead. And dead people don't raise themselves. So he's raised. Why, if that's true, and we have great sources, why would God raise Jesus if he were the worst heretic or that angry man that some Hindus might believe? Why would God raise a very poor example of a leader who said he was deity, and of course we know he wasn't, and said he was the path to eternal life? Of course he was crazy. So why would God say, you and you alone are my son, and I'm raising you from the dead? If you can't explain away the resurrection, I think you have to listen to the man's teachings.
So Jesus was very unique in his life and his death, and also in his resurrection. Before we close in, and it was really wonderful talking to you. Lastly, I just want to, for our viewers, you're writing or you're working on your magnum opus. So what is it going to be like? Can you please shed some light on, maybe a few things and what?
Yeah. Well, it's over 5,000 pages right now. It's 5,000 pages on the resurrection of Jesus. And the whole argument has to do with, does history back up this event? And then question number two, if history does back it up, what follows from that? I'll just give you one example. In the New Testament, Christians say that almost all of theology is true because of the resurrection. And almost all of practice is true because of the resurrection. But the doctrine that is traced to the resurrection of Jesus more than any other doctrine, almost 20 times in the New Testament, Christians have said, those who walk with Jesus, they've said, we will be raised like him. We know we'll be raised because he was raised, we saw him, and we're cemented to him. We're glued to him. So like him, so will we be. We'll be raised from the dead because we know what a resurrection is. Okay, so we've got this teaching now. Now you got three of them. There's a God. Jesus is the path to God. In fact, he was deity. He's the path to God, and he was raised from the dead. So now I have to answer the question, if I don't believe he was raised from the dead, okay, now I got to refute it. But if I do believe he was raised from the dead, how am I going to doubt my resurrection? And this 5,000 pages is a detailed historical argument. But what I emphasize is the guys I quote, by and large, are people who don't believe. By and large, the guys I quote they have to be specialists in the field, not just anybody who says anything. They've got to be a guy with a PhD in New Testament, theology, classics, archaeology, and they may not be Christians, but they say that this material is 1 to 2 years later, and I use them for everything. That Jesus taught, what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. He taught he was going to rise from the dead. He did. Here's the evidence. It's absolutely John Dominic Crossan, who's as much of a skeptic as anybody today. Crossan says, just for any of your listeners who are thinking maybe the man didn't die on the cross, John Dominic Crossan says the fact of Jesus' crucifixion is strongly proven as any fact in the ancient world. And he's not the only one that says it. Marcus Borg, another friend and arch skeptic of him, both Ludemann, a German atheist, New Testament scholar, Ehrman, an American atheist, New Testament scholar, they all will tell you, don't even go there on crucifixion. It is solid, solid, solid. And Ehrman and Ludemann don't even believe in God, and they don't believe in an afterlife. So if you want data, anybody can go on believing what they're believing. But if you want to believe with data, I'm not trying to sound prejudiced, but if you just go by data, Christianity has the strongest evidence in the world.
Yes, and it was really interesting discussion that we were having, and thank you, Dr. Habermas. From your busy schedule, you have taken time, and we really appreciate and the answers that you have given us, and it would be very useful for the people who watch this. And really, I'm wishing and expecting for your wonderful work that is going to come out, and I'm waiting forward to read it. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You're very kind. I appreciate your questions and enjoyed the time with you.